Hey, Refuge Church, we are here today talking about wholeness and well-being, specifically this week as it applies to our relationship with God and how we make space for God and practice that soul hospitality in our inner being. Let's pray and jump into it. God, I pray that you would be with me as I speak this morning, that you might fill me up with your spirit and help me to say things that are helpful and good for this community. I pray that you would be with the people who are listening, that they might have openness and also have ears attuned to where you might be leading them to try a new adventure or to think about their old patterns of doing things in new ways. Ask these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so yes, we've gone through this journey of talking about how we don't want to be in an unhealthy space of living from God or over God or under God or for God. And so as we talk about these different ways of creating soul hospitality, of making space, we just need to remind ourselves continually as we think about them that we are cultivating life with God, Skyjathani. We don't want to be rethinking about these things and start re-injecting those old behavior patterns or old thought patterns into what we're doing, right? So I just want us to be super cognizant and mindful of that process. And again, if it seems like you just aren't sure if God is a safe person for you, you can still take the time to work through those things. Don't need to immediately harangue yourself into jumping back into old spiritual disciplines. But so last week we talked about soul hospitality is made up of creating space for encounters with God to happen, because you cannot control God. You cannot force God to be in relationship with you. But you can create opportunities for that to happen. Secondly, it's about being present in that space. So there's a difference between saying, here I am doing my Bible study every morning, blah, 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 charging through the steps. You might be present maybe with yourself or maybe with what you're doing, but it's not being present to God and saying, here I am, I'm listening. There's a difference, right? And then the last piece in that was dialogue, right? Going back and forth, that I'm listening and then listening for a response or finding it in the discipline that you're pursuing. So this week we'll be pulling from, and in coming week, we'll be pulling from the work of Gary Thomas. He talks about spiritual temperaments or sacred pathways. It's not just his idea. He pulled that from someone else, and there's a broader perspective there. But the idea is God made people in a diverse number of ways, and we are invited to engage with God in that diverse number of ways that reflects the way that he made us. He is not surprised if you're a person who has trouble sitting through sermon or a person who always falls asleep while praying. God isn't like, what's happening here? He made you. He knows that you're that way. And so we're going to explore some different ways of being, some ways that you might resonate with, of saying, oh yeah, I always thought I had to be this way to be a Christian, but I really see myself in this spiritual temperament, or I really see myself in this title, whatever it might be. So that's my hope for you. But another reason to look at these is so that we can love not just ourselves and stop judging ourselves, but so that we can love our neighbor and other Christians and other people following God, and judge them less. Because sometimes when our Christian culture or ourselves puts one temperament on a pedestal, everybody else who's doing something differently then gets a scanty eye of, hey, are you really doing this for the right reasons or whatever? So we want to battle that and say, no, look at all of this glorious tapestry of diversity that God has made in humanity, right? So that's hope. Also, there's going to be some overlaps with the Enneagram, but just like in the Enneagram, the goal that I would have for you is not just to find one, although, man, if you can only find one, you're like, I don't know, but I'm into that thing. That's awesome. Super happy for you and cheer you on pursuing whatever that one pathway might be. However, hopefully over time as a person, we might be able to dabble and be more integrated between these different parts and say, you know what, I'm usually a person who gravitates to this, but because I'm with this community at this time, I can also find some life-giving nourishment in doing this. So don't be concerned if you're like, oh man, I love that, but I also love that. That's great. We're happy about that. Okay, disclaimers aside, that's Gary Thomas's stuff, but also I'll be pulling in from the works of Richard Foster, who's an amazing Quaker, whom I love, has had a massive impact on my life. Quakers, by the way, champions of equality, abolition, all the things that we love, decreased hierarchy in church spaces. Yes, don't listen to the lie that evangelicalism has been all that Christianity has ever been. There have been many wonderful people who seek after peace and justice all throughout the through line of history. But that is a side note. So let's jump in. There are 9 sacred pathways with various spiritual practices, spiritual formation, spiritual disciplines within each of those. Now, every spiritual discipline is not just tied to that one temperament, but I'm going to group some with each spiritual temperament. I'm going to look at is called the intellectual. I put this one up front and center because if you are a regular attender of Refuge Church, maybe you're coming from the world of Bama, there is a strong likelihood that you have at least some intellectual in you, which is holy and sacred in the way that God made you. You might be an intellectual if you love learning and understanding new things about God or from Scripture. An intellectual is someone who draws the closest to God or draws near to God via the mind. You need to be stimulated, and often you can know if you're an intellectual if you're frustrated by when others focus too much, your definition, right, on feelings and spiritual experience. Now, there is wonderful basis for the intellectual pathway in the text. Romans 12:2, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? One of the central parts of our being. Spiritual disciplines and practices might be things that you're already doing. If you are here listening to this, me talk, that can be a spiritual practice. If you are someone who listens to podcasts, if you're somebody who reads books on spiritual topics or things on the Bible or Christianity, even the history of Christianity, all of those things that you might already be doing count as spiritual practices. They're doing things that are feeding and nourishing the spiritual part of you, right? A Bible study, of course, is one that falls into this category. If you've never done Bible study before on your own, might recommend method of doing that would be writing a verse that catches your eye, because sometimes you can read lots of Bible and be like, oh, who knows what that was about, right? So find one verse that resonates with you, or a bunch, and having the eyes open to find one can transform your reading too. And write it out, and then off to the side maybe, do whatever cool designs you would like, write questions that you might have, right? Why is this going on? Why does it say this instead of this? What does that word even mean? And then after you do that, you can do some research, you can Google some things, you can ask someone in this community or Google, there's a whole treasure trove of things that'll probably, if you're an intellectual, light up your soul if you haven't pursued that before. So if you haven't ever done that before, There is a method. There is, of course, lots and lots of methods. However, let's talk about some temptations for the intellectual, right? So the whole focus of doing all these things is for soul hospitality, right? Intellectuals can be really drawn into gaining knowledge for reasons other than drawing close to God, right? To feel better about ourselves, to feel superior to other people, so that we can drop the well, actually, in discussion or in the comments somewhere, so that we can feel like we have the real truth while other people don't. That is not a spiritual discipline. That is feeding our ego rather than our spirit. And anything done without love, Paul says, is completely useless, right? So we want to be approaching learning, the disciplines of learning and study, with humility, with not looking for controversy, right? If you're looking for something in the text just so you can throw it in somebody else's face, that's probably not from the Spirit of God, just putting it out there. And then also the third temptation of the intellectual would be on knowing rather than doing, right? If I just know all this stuff, if I just have my doctrinal checklist, if I've just read all the books, then it does not matter whether I'm giving, whether I'm taking care of the poor, whether I'm honoring other people in my speech and action, right? No, really cares, because I have this huge library behind me, right? We want to be careful of that. If your reading is not making you love people more, maybe take a break from the reading. Just a thought. Maybe not, but something we want to be aware of when we talk about the intellectual. So if God has made you to love your podcasts and you devour them week after week, blessings on your journey. I'm so excited to learn from you and listen and trade recommendations. I'm sure something that will happen in the in discussion, 7:30 p.m. on Zoom on Sundays, Pacific Standard Time, or in person if you're in the Pullman area on Sundays. Okay, I do want to throw out, though, of course, what I don't want to happen here is for us to say, oh, yes, that's me, and then tune out for the rest of all these things. I'd like to bring a quote from Dr. Benner from the previous week, who says this about his own personal experience. For many years, my knowing of God was primarily a matter of knowing about him. Faith was more intellectual assent than emotional reliance or trust, and I related to God much more with my head than my heart. Despite the fact that the Word was made flesh, I tended to turn him back into words, my preferred medium of engagement. This left me feeling smugly dismissive of experiential approaches to Christian spirituality that are based on what I judge to be theologically weak foundations. Not surprisingly, it also resulted in a personal experience of God that was tremendously arid, right? So we've talked about how sometimes in the Exodus series, we said that you can be wondering if God's really still there and be not sure. And it's like going underneath all these different trees and waiting for maybe a drop of honey to fall on you. If you are not sure whether spiritual experiences are hogwash because your church background trained you either in a negative way or by trying to shove it on you, you're not sure if they're counterfeit, please come climb the trees with us and see, hey, look, here's the actual beehive, taste and see. The Lord is good, and that everybody is not just talking out of their butts about spiritual experience. Some people are, sure, but it's not everybody. I don't think so. A lot of Christian history would say otherwise. All right, maybe you're not intellectual at all, or maybe you're an intellectual person, but you don't like reading things on Christianity, blah, blah, blah. You don't connect with that particular pathway. Pathway number 2, what I'd like to bring forward, is the pathway of the activist. Woohoo! Drawing near to God via positive social change, right? When making change. So you might be an activist if you feel closest to God when engaging toward positive change. If you feel frustrated with other Christians for always missing the point, you might be an activist. And if you'd rather stand in a protest for an hour than listen to a PowerPoint on, different doctrines, you might be an activist. So there is an amazing tradition of activism in Christianity, like I already made mention to randomly, but also within the Bible. Moshe, who we just looked at in Exodus, what is the beginning of his spiritual journey, is saying, hey, that's unjust. I want to stop the oppression of my people, my ethnic minority, and standing up and murdering someone, which we wouldn't recommend as our primary way of activism, but there it is. Eliyahu, also has a major activist spirit, and in him we can see some of those temptations right off the bat, right? Eliyahu in 2 Kings is constantly saying, I'm the only one who really loves you and really serves you, and everyone else is left. And he is so complaining all the time that he damages the community around him, right? He causes the famine to continue and people die. But then he also gets called out of service by God because he's so racked with depression and anxiety that he cannot hear the voice of God anymore. So amazing, powerful person, does lots of miracles, but also someone who finds his identity in being the only one pursuing justice, right? So there's our temptations right off the bat. Being bitter and resentful of other people for missing it. Spending all their time in prayer would be a thing of the activist. And then also doing something out of a spirit of hatred, right? For Ahav, for King Ahav, and maybe his wife as well. That is not a spirit of love for his people. If Eliyahu had been motivated by love for the remnant, a trust that they were still there, he probably would not have called down a famine that caused even more people to die, right? So we want to make sure in our activism that first and foremost, it's still a space of soul hospitality for God that we're inviting God into and saying, here I am, I'm standing in this protest or march or whatever it is that I'm doing, and I want to listen to you, and I want to connect with you during this time. I want to be present with you, have dialogue with you. That's what we want to be doing, and we want to be doing it out of love, not hatred. That's the call, right? Another temptation while we're on them, without rest, activists, Gary Thomas says, may adopt the self-defeating motivations. So going, always tweeting, up at night, watching the videos, educating yourself, yelling at people in the comments. That is unhealthy activist behavior. Yes. All right. But into the positive things here. John Wesley says, there is no holiness but social holiness. To turn Christianity into a solitary religion is to destroy it. Examples who aren't biblical of activists would be Harriet Beecher Stowe, William Wilberforce, of course, achieved abolition with a lot of allies in Great Britain, and Charles Finney is a great example of someone just in the church, but who he refused to baptize people who were not abolitionists. He said, you're not truly a Christian, you have not really been converted if you still support slavery, which, man, if preachers started doing that now in our current political context, ooh, spicy, it would be exciting. All right, so what are some, maybe there, hopefully, well, I don't know, maybe there aren't protests going on in your community all the time. What are some things that you can do that feed your soul when it's not election year and you can't go knocking on doors or sending out notifications and etc., reminding people to vote? Also spiritual practice. Here are a couple things for you. Walking prayer is a big one. First off, if you're engaged in prayer and you're an activist, that is a huge deal. It's probably really hard, but yeah, it just might be hard based on what your type might be. However, walking prayer, if you've never heard of it or engaged in it, is the process of walking walking and praying. Shocking, I know. But so if you lived in Pullman and you wanted to pray for your community, it might be walking like that 5-mile loop around Pullman. And as you walk by Greek Row, you pray for those students. As you walk by the university, you pray for all the faculty, all the custodial staff, etc. As you walk by a center of town that has more poverty in it, you can pray for that. So as you go, you are led by your intuition, the spirit, right? And you see different things, and that physical act of walking, of course, is good in trauma recovery. If we remember rhythm, doing something with your body is so important. And you're engaging in your community and noticing and observing and becoming mindful and loving and having your heart drawn to, oh man, there's that broken down restaurant over there, nobody's purchased it, etc. Can be something that's a great way to remain in the spheres of justice and also create more space to be present, soul hospitality with God. Attending protests and doing social action of all sorts of kinds. There's, of course, many more social things than you can do other than attending protests, but those are also a big one. And thirdly, intercession is a way to practice being an activist. Now, if we are only ever saying that we're going to pray about an issue, but not engage in doing, right? That's not always helpful. If you are buying things that is made unethically by a 6-year-old girl in Bangladesh, i.e. clothing, and you say, oh, well, I'll pray for the 6-year-old girl in Bangladesh who's making my clothes, that I do not believe is something that biblically God is, really cool with. We have lots of things, lots of instances of God saying, why is it that you're coming before me with your prayers and sacrifices when you are not taking care of the poor? That's like the main thesis of the book of the prophets, right? The books. There's a lot of them with the prophets. But intercession still should not be chucked over the side as something that we should ignore. So if you've never heard of intercession, or you've never engaged with it, it's just praying for something other than yourself. Shocking, right? What an idea. Not just asking God for Lamborghini, but engaging in praying about issues of domestic violence. For instance, it can be an immensely both important force in your community, whether you believe that or not. And it can also be a place of pouring out your heart and your frustration and your anger against evil and injustice. And feeling that connection with God, because God also experiences those things, and creating this space, right? Both creates change in you and in your community. Very, very excellent. Okay, so that is activism, or the sacred pathway of the activist. The last one that I want to talk about today is the spiritual temperament, of being a caregiver. That was a hiccup. Just one though. In service, we draw near to God via loving other people. So if quintessentially 8s would be the activist in the Enneagram, quintessentially 2s will find themselves in the caregiver. Caring for others, Gary Thomas says, which I love, is a prophetic activity. This is placing dignity on everyone around you and everything that you're doing by saying it is worthy of you taking your time to serve it. If you need a biblical example, this would be Jesus. Hard to get around, right? We see Jesus, of course, in engaging in lots of these spiritual pathways, if not all of them. But this one continually, his ministry is marked by washing others' feet, healing, tending to people with demons, etc. He is always out there providing food for people. Jesus is a caregiver. Yes. Okay. So warnings before we jump into it more. As 2s know, caring is a disease when it is actually an act of taking. It is an act of deception expressed in loving others so that they will love or need us in return. That's not good. That's not what we're talking about here, right? If you're motivated by duty and hoping that you'll get human applause, that people will appreciate you and love you, and that people won't be able to reject you because you're so helpful, that's not a spiritual discipline. That's something you should go to therapy for, in that we love you. This is a safe space to talk about and to share and wrestle with through those things. But please do not trample around in unhealthy behaviors saying that it is a spiritual discipline for you. Thomas Kelly says, I find that he, being God, never guides us into an intolerable scramble of panting feverishness. So if you are a person who finds that your life is continually, oh man, I've got to do this and I have this going on, or I don't have time to take care of myself, my house, my family, or whatever, because there's all this stuff and we don't have time, that might not be coming out of an inward place of peace, abundance, and connection with God, right? So you could do a little self check-in there. Richard Foster divides self-righteous service versus true service. He says self-righteous service is defined by human effort. It wants to do things that are a big deal and to be seen as a big deal. It's looking for human applause. It's results oriented. Well, why did I even bother doing that if you were just going to do this? That's self-righteous service. It picks and chooses whom to serve, right? Saying, you are super annoying, so I'm not going to help you with that, but I want you to love me, so I'll go do that. It is a temporary, solitary activity, like, oh, now I will go and do this thing. And hear this, self-righteous service actually fractures community, because people who are not paying attention, or people who are aware that you are engaging in unhealthy activity for you, but allow it to happen, you're doing and digging yourself into a bigger hole of resentment and bitterness that you're not appreciated enough is not something that binds the community together, right? Because then you have a conversation between different people in your community of, oh, I heard that so-and-so is resentful of you because you didn't do this, and it creates big fractures in the community between people who, oh, I think that so-and-so is doing a great job, etc., etc. This is how one of the many ways, of course, not the solitary way, but one of the many ways the community gets fractured. So please don't. True service follows the whispered promptings of God. True service, rather than human effort. True service welcomes all opportunities to serve, not ones that will get you human applause or make you look like a big deal. So generous. True service is content with hiddenness. So it is happy at an event to do the dishes, whatever it might be, because whether or not anybody sees you back there, because it is the way that you are connecting with God. It's still it's not altruistic, right? You're still receiving a benefit, but the benefit is that you get to meet with God during that time via service. It is service-oriented rather than results-oriented. If nobody appreciates you, if it wasn't the most effective thing to do, it doesn't really matter because you're serving and that's good enough. It's indiscriminate, doesn't pick and choose between whom to serve. It's a lifestyle rather than being temporary, right? Paul calls himself a servant all the time. So did Jesus. And it builds community rather than fractures community. Now, is all this saying that we should not appreciate our servants and we should just say, yes, just stay there in the corner because you're blessing God right now, not me for you doing all my dishes for me? No. Does this mean that because we're being service-oriented rather than results-oriented, we do a bunch of stuff that's not particularly helpful because it doesn't matter because we're serving God? No, that's not what I'm saying. This is a list of guidelines that help us to see, am I in an area of health when I'm doing this? Am I engaging this as a spiritual practice, or am I engaging it in a way that creates bitterness in myself and in my community? That's what this is intended for. All right. Spiritual practices of the servant, or of the caregiver rather. I prefer caregiver really. Is small things, you know, like the dishes, like things I just mentioned, putting things away, taking things out, picking up something on your way home, etc. Guarding the reputation of others is a way of caregiving. Guarding the reputation of others is a spiritual practice of caregiving. Allowing yourself to be served is an act of caregiving. So you're caring for other people that they might be blessed. Also, that doesn't apply to you, power-hungry, crazy person who just doesn't want to do any work and wants to be served all the time. You're not blessing other people. But servants, allowing yourself to be served is a spiritual discipline. Being courteous to others is a spiritual discipline. Hospitality. Caregivers often love hospitality. For good reason. It's wonderful. God is hospitable caregiver, right? Listening is a spiritual practice of caregiving. Bearing one another's burdens is a spiritual act of caregiving. And of course, at the most extreme end, actually caregiving for someone. If you've worked with people with disabilities or end of life, volunteering at hospice, at an elder care center, even if maybe you just do that once a month, maybe that could be an amazing benefit. Of course, you should also be loving. Please don't hear that it's a spiritual practice and therefore it's a way of you communing with God, meaning that you don't love the people, in the elder care center. It's via your love for the elders at the elder care center that you connect with God. That makes sense? Hopefully that's what you hear. So Richard Foster sums up service by saying, service that is duty motivated brings death. Service that flows out of inward person is life, joy, and peace. So if you did not find yourself anywhere in the intellectual, the activist, or the caregiver as spiritual pathways, it is okay. We have 6 more to go. You have so many more opportunities to find yourself and experiment. Maybe you'll experiment with all of them. Maybe you just want to sit back and listen. That is all okay. I'm going to pray and let us go and hopefully have some wonderful adventures. Lord, I thank you that you want to draw close to us, that you want relationship with us, that you want wholeness and well-being in us and our relationship with you, that you don't want us to be driven out of unhealthy places of anger, of resentment, of judging other people. It's a big thing for all of the sacred pathways, right? As we all think that ours is the best way. I thank you that that stuff doesn't taint your vision of who we are, but rather you love that we're trying and you love that we're out there and doing it imperfectly. I pray that you would be with us, that you would help us say yes to whatever inner promptings, say, hey, maybe try this week. If we're not even in that place, please comfort us and be with us as we just say, you know what, I'm going to remain still. Thank you that you're not disappointed in us, but that you are with us in every breath and every moment in our community, cheering us on. Please help us not miss out on the amazing beauty and glorious joy that comes with being in relationship with you out of a place of wholeness and health. Ask all these things in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. All right. You can find us online at refugepullman.com. You can give there, and please feel free to come join us on Zoom or in person. Have a wonderful week, you guys. Bye.